missionaries Herb and Linda Gregg had traveled to Dagestan to teach and share their faith. At first, all was well. Then, on a cold fall evening, the unthinkable happened.
This nightmare thing, you always wonder if the very worst thing that you could imagine happened to you, if God would be there in that moment.
The First Chechen War for independence against Russia resulted in hundreds of kidnapping victims. Over 100,000 civilians lost their lives. While walking home after playing basketball with orphans, Herb was abducted by Islamic jihadists.
A big white car pulls up to my left. A guy hops out and stands right in front of me, flashes a police badge. That began 231 often desperate days among and being held by those jihadis.
For 7 months, Herb was held captive, beaten, threatened, and faced death on a daily basis.
The Hawks were the ones that really wanted to kill me as the American Christian missionary, regardless of the money issue.
We were informed that there was a video and that one of my dad's fingers had been cut off, and there had been a threat that there would be more of that type of thing if they didn't get the ransom money. And in fact, we were told that we shouldn't open any packages in the mail because we wouldn't know what we would get.
I think these men would have no problem killing my dad if they didn't come up with the money that they were requiring. Something they did on a regular basis and something they showed my dad that they did on a regular basis as well.
They told me that there was a camp in the mountains of Chechnya. A village was there, and people who did not come up with the cash were taken off to this camp and dispatched. Actually, they showed me an Islamic newspaper with 4 2-inch square heads whom they had beheaded at that killing camp, and said that was the same type of thing that was going to happen to me if I didn't come up with the money. The reason we went to Dagestan, out of all the republics that are in Russia, is because it had 34 totally unreached people groups. That means without the scriptures in their own language and without the knowledge of God. The main way we learn about God's attributes, of course, is through the Bible. However, sometimes He gives His people experiences where they also learn about those attributes, things like His power, His goodness, His mercy, His grace, His peace, His patience, and His victories. And that's what I experienced during those months.
I was at home making dinner, and I was getting a little bit peeved and thinking, where is he, and he usually came by now, and started to get worried. And all of a sudden there was this huge knock on my door, and I ran over and I opened the door, and it was Marat and Christine. Marat was the worship leader in our church in Dagestan, and Christine was our single worker in Dagestan at the time. They looked terrible, and they shouted out, "Is Herb here?" And I said, "No, I thought he was with you."
Then the guy that I had been wrestling with on the outside slid in, put pressure against me from the other side, put my sock cap down over my eyes, and just told me to be calm. This would only be a few months. And I remember asking God for help right off the bat, silently. And we were off and rolling.
Held down by his captors, whether he's being held hostage or taken somewhere to be killed, Herb simply doesn't know. Finally, they arrive at an isolated, dilapidated house.
A couple guys grabbed me. They had opened a little trap door and put me down into this pitch black cellar. There was a mattress down there, and I laid down. At that time, I still felt total peace from God. The same guy who had me pinned from the left side was guarding me, and he was pacing up and down, and he was just muttering to himself. I explained about money. He could have my daytimer was in my bag, which they had taken, and there was $100 bill. They could take that. There was $1,000 in the house. I was trying to reason with him that he could grab that money and have that money right off the bat, and then more or less forget this plan of kidnapping me and having me be gone for months.
So we went in the living room and sat down to pray. I prayed first, and then as they were praying, a thought came to me. I had this huge desire to tell Herb how much I loved him. Herb, I love you so much, and you're the most faithful person to the Lord that I know, and the big things and the little things. I realized that God knew that, and the youth meeting was on Saturday, and he must have known that this was going to happen on Wednesday. And so I realized that he was in control of everything. After a little while, the police knocked on the door, and about 6 of them came in, and they were all official and unorganized. And then they said, we gotta go. And it was like, by then it was like 7 o'clock at night. And I said, we gotta go where? And he said, just get in the car. So they took us to the police headquarters, and we went in this little dingy place with a little light bulb hanging in there. And we went into a room, and Alka, the little boy that was with Herb, was there, and they were questioning him. So we sat down, and I listened to them interrogate him like he did it. He was 13 years old. And it was an amazing thing. That's how I found out what happened to Herb, was by listening to Alka. I needed to call team, and they said, you've got to get out of there in 24 hours. And I said, I can't get out of here in 24 hours. And, they said, well, you have to, there's a chance that something could happen to you, and Christine has to get out too. So, I was talking to Christine, and we begged for a little more time. And finally they said, okay, 48 hours. In 48 hours, you have to get out. And the reason we didn't want to get out so soon was, when you work in a Muslim country, you can't just go in and, give a 5-minute gospel presentation. It is actually a pouring out of your life and love into the hearts and lives of people all around you. And it's a process. And so there were some people that we had not gotten to the end of the process of being able to fully explain who Jesus was. So we wanted time to do that. And I needed to call Amy, so I called Amy.
My heart dropped, and it was just really scary. And so I called my husband, who was at work, and asked him to come home. And then I called my brother, who was in college at the time, and I actually got a hold of his girlfriend, I think. And then just kind of, wanted to gather everybody so that we could pray and just wait. That was the beginning of the big, long wait.
I got the call in my dorm, picked up the phone, and my girlfriend at the time told me that my dad had been kidnapped. And we didn't know by who or why or what was going to happen. The time we thought maybe it had something to do with the Russian mob or mafia, but we didn't know for sure. And so really the last thing that I did, which should have been the first thing I did, I think, was close myself off in a room and decided I needed to drop to my knees and ask God for help, for peace, and for information, and that he would help my dad in the situation.
I went to bed, and I put my hand over on the place where Herb slept, and I patted it, and I just told him that I knew that God would take care of him and that I'd be praying.
Before dawn, Herb is dragged back into the car. After several hours, the car stops.
The men go ahead and cut the tape off my hands and allow me to see, remove the sock cap from my eyes. And I'm transferred over to the power of 2 men, I assumed they were Chechens, in another vehicle, and we do a lot of more driving.
What lies ahead? Herb can't be sure. Finally, the second car stops, and Herb's captors pull him from the car alongside a road in a mountainous, snow-covered valley.
And I just had a feeling that maybe this is my end. And so I thought to myself, this would be a great place to die. And at that time, I was not very emotional about it. I just had the feeling that this was going to be it. And then I knew that was not the program once we got down the slope and I saw the cabin.
Herb and his captors enter the cabin and wait. For what? Herb cannot guess. He spends the night pacing and praying until exhaustion overtakes him, and then he is finally able to sleep.
Early morning, we're up and out of there. There is a military-like long Jeep awaiting us.
It is in the Jeep that Herb first encounters the men who will hold his life in their hands for the grueling months ahead. One, named Hassan, begins hammering Herb with questions.
I had explained to him that we were part of a humanitarian organization that also works with people spiritually, and I quoted Revelation 1:5 to him, and that really made him furious. And so he whacked me several times about the head and shoulders and exclaimed, what did I mean about God's forgiveness?
After a long, hard ride, they arrive. Herb is taken from the Jeep to his prison, a second-story room in a dilapidated Soviet-era school. A brick floor, no electricity, bullet holes in the concrete walls, a bare mat on the floor.
They explaining what they expected of me. They wanted me to instantly get on all fours, have the sock cap over my eyes, my nose into the corner when anyone came into the room, because they didn't want me seeing their faces, and which is what I did for months. Except one day I got a little slack with that, and saw him come in and just looked at him. He said, if you do that again, I'm going to cut your head off. Early in the incarceration there in Chechnya, I realized I was in big trouble. And I thought of a verse, a part of Psalm 44:4, which says, command victories for Jacob. And I knew I really needed desperately powerful, real victories from God. I felt like a little Jacob surrounded by Esau's, and I just knew I needed God's victories for that time.
Herb began giving his captors nicknames based on their physical characteristics, or the way that they treated him.
A big man with some authority among them, I called Bear. He had a heavy walk and a heavy talk, a heavy voice. Then, of course, Kicker. He was very active. He seemed athletic and active, always running around talking to this person or that person about me and my situation, and being totally antagonistic against me. There was Nice, who was much more calm, although very, very serious, and so I called him Nice. Hassan, that really wasn't a nickname, that was what he called himself. There was Cap. He never let me know his name, so I call him Cap for captor. He was the one that worked on the phone a lot, and the money issues, and would be talking to the prisoners and their people over the phone. In that little washroom was the peace of God, which was utterly extraordinary. It was almost so thick you could slice it. It was very, very peaceful, and I felt I was being protected by God, and I was in an ark, like Noah's Ark, and I was in that little space, and death, darkness, and destruction were all around, but there was great peace inside.
Meanwhile, after an emotional goodbye with their friends and supporters, Linda and Christine board an Aeroflot plane.
And yet, as we flew off toward Moscow, I knew that God was in it and God was going to be with us and he would be with them. And so we winged our way toward Moscow.
After an interview with the Consul General, FBI, and the Russian authorities, a policewoman then tells Linda that she must go home to America.
I needed to go home and I needed to bury myself because I was the weakest link. And they would try to get a hold of me and make demands. And if I couldn't meet the demands, then they would have to hurt Herb to show that they were serious. So I needed to leave, and she knew it was hard. Then I told her that my hope was in the Lord, and she said that with God's help that he would get out. Then the FBI man came and told me I was right, that my hope was in the Lord. That was pretty much my experience at the American Embassy. I knew that all of these people, God would be working in their lives to help.
For most of that time, I only ate 2 times a day, 2 cans filled with white macaroni. The jihadis had the goal of extracting $3.5 million from me or executing me. They lived for jihad. Holy war was their life.
All of this as Linda boards the difficult flight back home.
I was leaving Herb. I was leaving my friends. I was leaving my work. And frankly, I felt like I was in free fall. But I knew that God was going to catch me. I did have a Walkman, which dates me, and it was new, and somebody had given it to us, and I had throw in a couple of cassette tapes, and so I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to just listen and worship for a bit. My heart was in such a state that as I listened to the music, I started crying. And I realized that in comparison to this day, I had never sung a song or hymn in my life and meant it in the way that I did this day. And as I listened to it more and more, it wasn't only like I was listening to the music, it's like it was coming right out of my heart. And I was the author of the music. And it was honestly one of the most marvelous times of worship of my whole life, because it came from the core of my being, right straight to God. All of a sudden, I was just enveloped in this light. And it wasn't like the light of the sun or a light of a light bulb or anything I'd ever known. It was just gorgeous white light. I realized that I was in the presence of God. He just kept revealing himself, and it was so personal and so wonderful. And I knew what I couldn't know in a way I didn't know. And it was like seeing his beautiful, wonderful, magnificent face and who he is in a real way. The first thing was I realized, God, if this is the way you are, and you take Herb to be with you, well, take me too. And so the thing that it did was release me from the fear of if he did take Herb. I realized where Herb was going and who he was going to be with. Something about death and our loved ones going to be with Jesus that we're missing the magnificence of who they're going to be with. And then the third thing that I thought was, God, this is what I've wanted all of my life, is to know you like this.
So when I was about to see my mom, I felt just nervous because I wasn't sure what her not just her demeanor, but just where she was at. I hadn't seen her. I'd only heard her voice. It had been a few days since my dad had been taken. And I was just anxious about what my role was going to be, how I was going to go be hopefully a strength to her, an encouragement to her, when really I felt like I was shaking in my boots, So then she comes and meets me, and something about her face, something about everything that she had to say, there was this sweetness and in fact, this enthusiasm. She said, "Amy, I need to tell you something that God has done. No matter what happens, God has shown me something and I don't have words for it, but I know that it's going to be okay no matter what happens, even if the very worst that we could possibly imagine were to happen." And something about the way that she was expressing herself, not even really the words, but this sweetness, this beautiful spirit that you could tell had been ministered to by God, instantly made everything different. I knew at that point, really, truly, that it would be okay. And I don't mean that in a trite way at all, because it wouldn't be without suffering, but that God was sustaining her, and that He would do that fully and completely, and that He would do that for me, that He would do that for my dad, and that He would help us bear whatever it is that He was going to call us to bear. And there was just a turning point at that moment, and seeing her, that she was not in despair.
Quite a few times, or several times as I remember it, they would come and say, "We're going to cut your nose off. We're going to cut your ears off." Cap got really angry with me one night and said he was going to kill me.
Herb identifies two factions among his captors: the Doves, who want to keep him alive in order to collect the ransom, and the Hawks, who want nothing more than to kill him as quickly as possible.
One night was very bad. Hassan and Kicker and Bear had worked out to haul me off to the killing camp.
The killing camp, called the Lagir, where Herb heard the Hawks talking about forcing him to run a gauntlet line in which he would be beaten to death, or have chains wrapped around him and dropped into a lake, or simply shooting him.
And I was feeling absolutely desperate at that time, knowing I was going to be hauled off. And so they, strangely enough, wanted me to have tennis shoes up there too, even though the plan was to kill me fairly soon upon arrival. So they started looking for the shoes. Apparently they had various closets where things were stashed, and they could not find those tennis shoes. All of them just gave it up except Hassan, who went berserk. He went through every closet and just would slam doors after not finding the shoes, and then go to the next closet until all the closets were gone through and my shoes had disappeared. And after a few minutes, Bear said, "This is God." And he stopped and he walked away. And the other guys desisted also. A couple months before that, they had given me a candle and matches to eat by. And God would not allow them to haul me off. But as I sat there, those days and nights and the weeks went by, the candle flattened out. And this is what happened to it as I sat there all that time. And as I pondered that afterwards, I realized that's what God was trying to do with me. Just flatten that ego, that self, that sin that gets in the way of His work. And it was just a marvelous revival time that God was giving me.
When I got home, it was Thanksgiving with his parents and everything. And that was hard. And Christmas came, and Herb's birthday came, and, all of these times came that made it hard to not have him there and to not know if he would ever be back. And so one day, as I was praying and asking him to show me what he wanted for me, I had a quiet time in Romans 5, the section around 3 where he says, don't be upset when trials come into your life, because I'm producing perseverance, character, and hope. And so I had a vision and a goal for the time, and that was that I would share about how marvelous God was, even before Herb got out of captivity, if he ever did. And that people would believe it, because I didn't see the result yet.
The first video of the 3, he told me what to say, and he wanted it to be in Russian. And so I just rehearsed it over and over and over, really concerned that I would say it according to the way he wanted. I was really, really, really tempted to actually wink at the camera, to let the people watching this in the future, the Americans, know that I was okay, or I wasn't as in bad shape as he wanted me to communicate. But I didn't. I played the role totally as best I could.
Yes, I remember seeing that video. It made me just really taste anger to my depths, which, I feel that anger was one of the real emotions throughout this entire experience that kept coming up. It kept raising this question of, this is so wrong, this is so violating. How in the world do you actually, in fact, embody loving your enemies when you just want, at that point, them to be destroyed and your dad rescued? And how are you supposed to simultaneously love somebody when they are causing such terror to your dad and to your family? How do we live that out when the very, I just want to roar, I just want to rip something up?
And I remember watching the video to try to analyze it best I could, and he still seemed fairly sharp physically and mentally. And I could tell because he was speaking Russian pretty well, and his movements were sharp, and his eyes were still his eyes. And even though he was speaking a different language, I could tell he was still okay.
Yes, we had someone come out and sit in our living room, and they're talking to us about kind of the business of kidnappings. And granted, this particular person that came out had really was actively dealing with some kidnappings in Colombia, South America, and, the nature of those types of kidnappings were often, they thought, different from this type of kidnapping. And yet, there's not that many experts on this particular topic. And so they had brought them to talk to us and kind of presenting how this works, whose role, what the negotiator does, what the government does, how this whole game works. I just started having all these questions and really just uncomfortable with the fact that it felt exactly like a game, and I didn't know if there was anything to be done about that, but it felt like, we're playing games here. This is business as usual to, somebody with my dad's life.
We were being told also that our negotiator was one of our best allies in this situation. He knew and understood the area and the environment, and he knew he would have the best reasoning capabilities with these Chechen Muslim rebels to get my dad out. So we were really, really trusting, I think, of this Russian negotiator.
Known as Mr. K was Herb's lifeline, a stranger communicating with the terrorists, knowing that one wrong word or mistake could cost Herb his life.
These jihadis, this whole scene was very international. My main guard for most of those months outside my front door was an American guy.
In mid-February, through his locked door, Herb overhears a couple named Peter and Debbie. They have British or Australian accents and are working with the jihadists to help them achieve their goals.
Peter and Debbie are there for about a week, and then they finally say goodbye and they're on their way out. Hassan is so antsy to cut my hand off that he can't wait till they get off the premises to cut. So he rushes to start getting things ready. I think a certain flat board and a knife or whatever to cut. And someone informs Peter and Debbie, and they come back and get in his face and argue with him and don't let him cut. And that was the first day of 3 weeks of that happening every day. They stayed there day and night fighting for my cause.
And so began what Herb calls the marathon of death.
2 or 3 times a day, the jihadis would gather in a group and confer about me and what to do about the whole situation. And there was a debate between the hawks and the doves about how much of my hand or fingers to cut. I was sitting against the wall, kind of close to the front door one day when the door opened, and 2 guys came in, picked me up, and walked me down the hall into a large room with a close-cropped carpet. And in the middle of that room was a cloth. I had been thinking and reasoning within myself before, okay, what type of reaction might help me in this situation? Would yelling and crying and blubbering help me, or would trying to reason help me? And I realized nothing I didn't think would help me. So the only thing that would do, apparently, in that situation would be to just take it calmly, because I didn't want them to get so furious they would cut my head off right then. I noticed a young man at the other end of the room, towards the corner, sitting on the floor. And as I sat down and stuck my hand out on the cloth, I glanced up at him and we met eyes. And I'm sure I'll never forget it. And if he's still alive, he'll probably never forget it either. We made that eye contact and we saw the situation we both had. And then they said, "Oh, ni nada," which means that's not necessary. And they picked me up and walked me back to my room. As I thought about it, I was wondering why they did the whole routine. What I came up with is that they maybe did this just to check out the courage aspect. That in their way of life, I think that's one of the very highest values, the courage of a warrior. So they wanted to, I think, see how I would react in dire straits like that.
I got information from the State Department once a month, usually, and my contact had worked on this type of thing, and he was kind of hardened to it, I guess you could say. He told me the truth, the way he saw it all the time. And so he was the one that told me he didn't think probably there was 1% chance Herb would get out of captivity alive. And there were several reasons. One was because, of course, he was a Christian, a missionary, living in Dagestan, that they considered that their territory. And he was being held in Chechnya, they knew after a while. And so the Russians couldn't just, rush in like they could in Dagestan. And the main thing was he was the only American they ever got.
So I do remember this example where they had said, okay, so here's how it works. For example, we never say no. You never say no outright to the kidnapper. Even if you don't intend to give them the money, you never say no. This is a negotiation. And so you're saying yes to something, just not to what they ask. So if they ask for, $1 million, in our case, $3 million, they ask for that. In Colombia, you might say, how about a truck full of rice? All of that kind of gaining back and forth just brought such anxiety to my soul. I just thought, how can that be? How can we be doing this? I mean, we're talking about a life. We're talking about my dad's life. We're talking about, not a truck full of rice.
it's not like the movies where, you send a SEAL team in and they take the person and everything's usually okay. But usually that's always the last resort to do a military intervention. That's what we were being told, because when that happens, a high percentage of the time the kidnappee gets shot before they get saved. But we even had private former military people come to approach us and ask if they would want us to go try to rescue him physically. I remember had a guy come to our house and interview us. We interviewed him actually, and he wanted to know if this was something that we wanted to do, and to pay him to send a team over there to try to intervene. As this developed, I started to understand and realize that I was developing a root of bitterness towards Islam and Muslims in general. I didn't understand why they had done this to him when he was there essentially helping them and their people in their country. And so I started to get angry inside and wanted to, in a sense, get revenge. And I even had thoughts of going to the local mosque and kidnapping a Muslim and doing the same thing. And I realized that was just out of ignorance and fear, really. And I needed to give it over to God. But that bitterness and anger lasted for a while.
The second taping took place around January 16th, and it was a very discouraging session for me in the sense that they didn't wear their masks. Cap and Hassan did not have their full head mask gear on. And I realized instantly that they thought they didn't need it, quite probably because I was going to be dead and I wouldn't be able to identify them later on. They weren't in any danger of being ID'd or anything like that, so they just didn't wear masks, which was really a downer for me. But that's when they really explained to me a lot of things. That's when they showed me the pictures of those 4 technicians decapitated. That's when they said that would happen to me at the killing camp during that particular session. They really wanted to impress upon me how serious and dangerous everything was.
We were told if we didn't recognize the number on our caller ID, at the time we had caller ID, to not pick up the phone. And this was an unknown phone number, so we didn't pick up. And when the answering machine picked up, a voice in Russian, heavy Russian accent, came on. And I could tell right away it was my dad's kidnappers. And they were asking for us to pick up the phone in Russian. And then my dad actually got on the phone as well. And that was particularly difficult. It was great hearing his voice in a sense, but it was very difficult to not be able to pick up the phone and just talk to him. We had to be careful not to do that, we were told, so that we wouldn't say the wrong things that might trigger them to do something to my dad that would be worse.
I'm in my kitchen doing my dishes, and the phone rings, and I can tell from this echoey sound at the other end that it's the captors. And this one day, I was at home alone, and I heard this sound, and I thought, you know what? If my dad is on the other line, I just want to tell him I love him. If he doesn't make it, I want to be able to say one more time that I love him. And I heard his voice, and that's how I knew for sure it was them, of course, because he said, Amy. So I picked up the phone, and I just said, Dad, I cannot talk to you, but I love you. I love you, Dad. And I hung up. It was a real gift, actually, to have just that word, Amy, on the phone, on my answering machine. And I kept it for a really long time.
Around the new year, Cap took me up to one of those large classrooms, sat me down on a mat, got face to face with me, and we had this very heavy encounter. And he was very, very intense. It was like I could feel the hatred breathing out of him. There was a verse that flashed into my memory, which is part of Psalm chapter 44, verse 4, which says, command victories for Jacob. I knew I needed 4 real victories. And one of them was not to have my hand cut off. The other was not to be hauled off to the killing camp. The other was the money issue, the $3.5 million, to have victory in that situation. And the other was the release. I needed God's powerful victories. I remember the story about Hezekiah, the righteous king of Judah, and how God announced to him that he was to die through the prophet Isaiah. And so how the man wept and talked to God and asked him for more time, if that could be his will. And God answered that and pulled him out of the situation of death. And that because our God today is the same as those ancient times, that I could ask God for that and he could do it.
And so that was an incredible comfort to be able to know that he didn't need to have a physical Bible with him, that he had the word completely in his heart and in his mind that would strengthen him and be, wielded during this time and be applied, actively. But for me, just knowing that this was who he was, well, it's one of the biggest blessings of my life.
One day, Cap enters Herb's room and asks if Herb can breathe through his nose. The question confuses Herb. The time has come, Cap says, to show the authorities that the time to pay for Herb's release is running out.
He had me sit down and handcuff my left wrist to the pipe with the radiator heater. And then he had a guy come in with the full head mask. And he explained they didn't want me yelling out, so the guy would hold my nose, thus the question on if I could breathe okay with my nose. He has for a few minutes this maybe 3/4 inch wide piece of rubber around the base of my index finger. And after a while it becomes numb and white, so he pops that thing off. And with his hunting knife, quickly saws at the joint, and the finger was off.
That, for whatever reason, was particularly difficult to mentally process, that they were torturing him to that extent, and we didn't know if the next thing to go was going to be his hand or his head. And then all those things, just having to give that up to God and still love God. So he's allowing your father, your dad, to go through that and still love the father, right? So, yeah, there was a lot of lessons learned, I think. And then the ultimate lesson for me was, well, what would I have done had my dad been killed? How would that have changed my relationship with God?
I just remember our family at that point we'd been through a lot of months. We were wearing really thin here. And we decided to go up to a cabin. Some friends had offered us some time at this little cabin in the woods. I had my son and asked my husband to take him for a walk because I needed to wrestle some things out with God. I needed to come face to face with him and just pour out this living rage that was starting to take hold inside and I knew would destroy me. I just was so angry. To my depths, in a rage that I didn't know, honestly, how you can survive that kind of anger, and that kind of questioning. And really, ultimately, I think it was this anger at God, at the fact that this could happen, that this was happening, in fact. And where was he? What is this? Where's mercy come from, and where's justice? And I don't know. I had so much that really couldn't even be articulated, but the terror of it all just consumed me at that point. And so trying to read the scripture, and I there's that, like I said, there's this picture window beside me and, these little birds. And at one point I turned my head because there's this squirrel that just keeps running back and forth and eating everything. And I start looking at its tail and I start looking at its little nails as it's eating these seeds. And just kind of the gradient even of the hair on its tails and the tiny details of this little beast. And at that particular moment, it was as if God said to me, and probably the closest that I've ever heard of audible communication with God, but to me it was audible. It was, could you make one of those nails? Could you make a hair on that squirrel? I think at that moment it was like, here's a different question. And I went from anger and rage and fury to, in my heart, literal music and light and worship. And I knew that was not me. There was nothing in me that brought that about. That was God reminding me, I am God. You are not. And there's unbelievable strength and comfort and song in that. And that was it. It's one of those life-defining moments for me.
And then another thing that I remember that was difficult was going to church and seeing nominal Christianity and pettiness during that time as well in the church setting. And thinking about what my dad was going through, not to be arrogant or prideful in any way, but it was hard to go through things that really didn't matter. It made me make life decisions as well. What do I want to devote my life to? And what kind of Christian do I want to be? Do I want to be nominal in my belief, or do I want to follow this through to the end?
Cap actually explained that the reason that right index finger was cut off was because I didn't raise it and say, like many Muslims do, God is one and Muhammad is his prophet. He also explained that they had to show some fierce action in the context of their threats to do things like that if money was not coughed up.
There was another reason why Herb's captors were becoming more desperate, one that Herb could know nothing about. Communication with the Russian negotiator, Mr. K, had suddenly stopped.
He had a heart attack about the time they cut Herb's finger off and they couldn't get a hold of him. So I heard that that's why they cut the finger off, because there wasn't any communication for a little bit and they didn't know what it was, so they had to show they were serious.
And they thought that we were ignoring their demands. So I do know that fact as well about the negotiator. And after his heart attack, he actually came back to the case and continued working on it and was very persistent to get my dad out.
But that man got up off his heart attack bed and continued to the end. And at one point, I think he actually offered to trade places with Herb.
I never met Mr. K that I know of. And he was actually a Caucasus man. He was originally from that zone. He knew the culture and something of the languages of that area, though he was working for the Russians.
There was this series of events where it seemed like, the negotiation process kept changing. Different people would get removed from the team, or, we had different factors going on all the time. And it was really hard, one, to have confidence that they were going to be able to pull this off. It seemed like, honestly, completely impossible that this could actually work out.
3 times during those months, I had a pistol pointed to my face. The 3rd time was the last time I saw Cap, a few days before the actual release. When he came in, that's when he had stated in kind of a disgruntled way. Oh, you weren't really serious about checking out Islam. And then he asked me, are you tired? And I said, yeah, I was tired. And he whips out his pistol, points it at me, and says, well, you could die after I shoot you. But I could tell it was all an act, because he knew the decision had been made and that the release was on.
Herb's intuition was correct. After months in captivity, facing death hour after hour, somehow, the negotiator had pulled off a miracle. The question now was if Herb would survive to finally be free again.
The day of my release, really unforgettable. My food server takes me by the shoulder, and we literally trot downstairs, because right down the hall were the guys who wanted to slit my throat. So we didn't want to give them a chance to do that. So we trotted down to the main entrance. And there were a shelf there of slippers, and he threw down a pair of slippers for me. I put them on, walked out, and it was kind of a rainy, muddy day. And there were two cars, and a guy and one behind the other, and a man standing in front of each car. A short guy on the left car and taller guy in the right car. The guy on the left said, you want to go home? And I said, yeah.
Why did the jihadists agree to finally release Herb without taking his life? In the end, it is quite possible that Mr. K and the Russian government simply outsmarted them.
Ultimately, we know that he was taken from one group to another, and each group prior had thought that the payment had been received already, and so they passed him on to the next group. We don't know for sure if that's what happened. Only God knows really how he got released. We know, in my mind, that the fact that he never denied Christ throughout that whole time was something that I think made those Chechen extremists respect the fact and actually honor a little bit. And I think that had he recanted or showed weakness in that area, that he probably wouldn't be with us today. I think that they respected his devotion to the point of death, and they needed to see a Christian be willing to do that. Just like they are actually willing to be killed for their cause as well. So my dad describes them as being, he felt like he was amongst a bunch of wolves, and God had taken him out from the middle of those wolves, and they had seen something of Christ-likeness through my dad.
We're driving along, and I'm disoriented where we are. All of a sudden, we pass a small building with a small green flag saying Chechnya. And then shortly after that, we come to another checkpoint, and we are in Ingushetia.
From there, Herb is escorted into a large palatial building.
And there's just piles of food. The guy at the head of the table advised me to slow down on my eating. I would get sick. I told him no. All those 7 months I didn't have any veggies, and this was delicious, and I just kept packing it away as we talked. And it didn't take long before that lunch was over with, and it was time to go and be flown back to Moscow.
I was sleeping. It was 6 o'clock or so in the morning in Arizona in June. It was flooded. My room was flooded with sunlight, and the phone rang. And so I thought, oh, it's late. So I tried to act like I was awake, and I picked up the phone and I said, hello. And it was Bill Daniels from the State Department. And I said, oh, hi, Bill, how are you? And he says, I'm real good. How are you? And I said, well, just doing great. And so he said, I have some good news for you. And I said, you do? What is it? And he said, Herb is out. And because I didn't think he meant out like released out, I'm trying to think. He's out, maybe knocked out or what, So I said, I don't understand. What do you mean? And he said, I mean that he's on a plane right now, winging his way toward Moscow. And I thought, I couldn't believe it. I came up out of that bed like levitation. It was like every good thing. It was the best thing. It was like every good emotion I ever had all rolled into one thing. And I came right up out of there and I started screaming, Daddy's out! Daddy's out! And we all just jump up. I mean, my brother was there. I think he was sleeping on the couch, and he jumps up, and everybody is jumping up. And it was just, I don't know, ecstatic, like a joy that I have, the relief that is indescribable. And of course, then we found out more. Like, truly, he's out. He's on his way to Moscow. He is out. Go turn on the TV, they said. You're going to watch this news press conference. And then they were, my mom, get ready. You're going to fly to Moscow. So it was just amazing. How could there be words to capture such a thing?
And of course, then there was this flurry of joy and laughter and hugging, and probably the happiest moment I've ever had in terms of elation and relief. And gratitude to God for allowing my dad to be freed from that situation.
We deboard the plane, and I'm flanked by various officials and people, and I noticed this huge group of young journalists, the Americans who had come out there to this tarmac, and then one of them asked, what would you say to your captors today? And I think God helped me with that answer also. And I said, I would tell them that God really loves them.
And that was good for me to hear, as I learned that if he can show them love and grace, having gone through that, then of course I needed to learn from that and have that mentality as well.
So we took off really soon. We took off for London. And so, we're just rejoicing and everything. And we got over to London and we went right to the airport. And so I saw some taller men. There was the partition. I saw them coming. I knew Herb was coming. And he turned the corner to come toward me. And honest to Pete, he was a little bit bent over and all the hair was gone. And he looked so thin. And I thought he looked about 80 years old. And then I looked in his eyes, and there was so much strength and joy and peace and love in his eyes that I knew that he had been with Jesus just like I was during my time. And everything was going to be okay. So he came flying over to me and we hugged for I don't know how long. And they let us go into another room by ourselves and we just hugged.
He had, I'm just going to cry. Both of them, had been so refined. It was like, bones, because he was so thin. He had this, such a thin face, and yet he was glowing.
It was amazing. There was no anger or hatred, bad feeling, nothing in his heart toward his captors. Absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, he felt that they were more captive than he was in their Islam that kept them chained to trying to get to heaven through, whatever means, instead of through Jesus. And so that was what he had tried to do, was just show them the love of Jesus the whole time that he was there.
One of the reasons this whole thing happened, of course, was about God's love. We had been very busy in Mahachkala. After all, we were working on reaching, if possible, 34 unreached people groups. And so we didn't think about the Chechens. We knew what a savage country bereft of spiritual light it was, and we didn't even think about it. So what did God do? He took this little Jonah from Mahachkala, from that side of the country, the eastern part of Dagestan, and got me transported right into the midst of these Chechen rebels, extremists, thinking about them and their lives and souls. And as I reflected about this, I realized that's the difference between man's love and God's love. We weren't even thinking about them, and God was loving them.
We get so caught up in living and life in this material world and the things that attract us that we don't realize that God has a work that He's doing here. His kingdom is coming, and He wants us to earth as it is in heaven, and He wants us to be a part of it. And it's so exciting. And, all of these things that He puts us through are just molding us to be a part of this wonderful, wonderful plan to save us so that we can be with Him forever.
God is in control ultimately of every aspect of our life, and He will give us the strength when we need it. And whether it be getting a call from your doctor that something was found on an x-ray, whether it be standing up for Christ at school, whatever it may be that you're going through, relationships, whatever it is, that God will give you the strength at the time to get through that. And if He doesn't, He may just bring you home to be with Him, which in the end is ultimately the best place to be. So that's one thing that I took away from this, is that God will give us the strength in the midst of the hardship.
It really reminded me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they were in the fiery furnace with Jesus, and when they got out, they weren't burned, and they didn't even smell like smoke. Herb had been in the fiery furnace, and here he was out, and he didn't get burned, and he didn't smell like smoke either. Christians today, we just don't believe that God is the same God that He was in the days of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but He is, and that can be our hope. That no matter what He brings us to in our lives, He can be there in all of His power and ability and love, and He can meet us there and He can take us through. Whether He takes us to glory or whether He does like He did with Herb and give us more time, He's the same, and we can bank on it.
Suffering requires such deep roots to draw from. Your roots have to go deep into this soil. Knowing that my dad had that so well established in his heart. But this refining that God did in me personally, like the story that I shared about kind of that encounter with God of who He is, the humility that suffering brings, because you realize how very, very small and powerless we are, and how truly magnificent He is, regardless of what the results, regardless of the outcome. It's really not about the outcome, and there's other things in my life that, the outcome is not like that, and yet the goodness and faithfulness of God to keep us, that though we struggle toward Him. And He's so very worth it.